was saying, because a lot of times if you want to get good NPS measurements, you need tracer work in it. And there's very few universities that you can really do a lot of tracer stuff, because a lot of times tracer, you need...
Ready to go?
Let's do it.
All right. All right. We are with Dr. Matt Stratton. I'm Dr. Kurt Escobar, and this is one day soon to be Dr. Josh Claren. Here in the flesh with Dr. Matt Stratton.
What's up?
Matt, we go back a bit.
Just a bit.
Just a bit. This is the first episode of interviewing a person. And I thought you'd be the perfect person because you studied a bit of a thing that gets a lot of hype online, social media, and podcasts, which is intermittent fasting. But before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you started, how you got into it, and how you got to where you are now?
Sure. So I won't go over, I guess, too in deep of the full thing, because otherwise
where were you
be
conceived?
Where we're going to be forever. I'm going to guess it was on Buttonwood in Palm Desert, California.
Okay. It's hot out there right now.
Yes, it's very hot right now. The reason I'm guessing that because that's where my parents lived before I was born. I can't remember when they moved to the house that they lived in when I was born. But so maybe it was actually in the Bisker house. I can't remember.
We don't need to check the references for that one, just so you know.
Okay. But essentially, yeah, so I grew up in Southern California, or as I like to call it, the land of In-N-Out. And it's the same thing. I have this fight with my students every place that I go. So like I've been in New Mexico, Georgia, Texas, and now here in Alabama, where In-N-Out versus Whataburger is a giant thing.
There ain't no competition.
And that's the thing.
Competition.
I would legitimately almost have to run for cover in Texas when I would say this to start all my classes, but I will always say In-N-Out over Whataburger, no matter what, to this day. Still one of my proudest achievements of my entire life is, and granted, I've won worlds and done all this kind of stuff, is eating 2 4x4s in one sitting. And that was because when I was at New Mexico, I was in the travel band. So before I was in the bro science stuff, I was all about the marching band, classical music world, and all that kind of stuff. And so we were with the travel band. Exactly. And we were in Vegas for the Mountain West tournament, and that was the closest In-N-Out for that we were going to see for a long time. So right before we left to head back to Albuquerque, we stopped at In-N-Out, and I was like, all right, I'm going to get 2 4x4s. I'm going to eat one now. I'm going to eat one on the bus going back. It did not make it to the bus going back. And so I ended up just sitting there and eating both 4x4s in that one sitting. And that to this day is still one of my proudest achievements. But yeah,
my parents knew when they picked me up from the airport from Albuquerque, the first thing that we were hitting was In-N-Out, and the last thing before they dropped me off at the airport was In-N-Out.
Yes.
Or if I was driving, I would hit the last In-N-Out in, I don't know, wherever it was in Arizona before getting back to Albuquerque.
Yeah, I think there was one maybe in like Flagstaff or something like that, but
you're gonna know what that's like.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. Like as soon as I got that acceptance letter from Oregon, I was like, "Where's the closest In-N-Out to Oregon?" Like I'm gonna stop by there.
The only thing I will give people at the other places for a little bit credit for is I do think In-N-Out's fries suck. But the trick that I found, at least for me personally, is if you ask for them well done, then they do like the double fry, and then it gives it a little bit more of the normal fry texture instead of the softer fry texture. And so ask for them well done, put a little salt on them, then they're still pretty good. But still, burger for burger, you're not going to beat it. I'm sorry. So grew up in SoCal, spent the first about 25 years of my life there. Then That's when I was big and kind of like marching band and all that kind of stuff. And I know everyone's probably thinking, band nerd and lifting, those two always go together. Um,
Is it true?
and in this instance, no, but up until um, about senior year of high school, I was a prototypical band nerd, wanted to do nothing but go home and play video games all day. So at the time, it was Guitar Hero 2 and Guitar Hero 3 were my big ones. And uh, then my senior year of high school, I got into drum corps, which the easiest way to explain it is essentially a professional marching band. And so a normal tour for them, like their tour season is right now in the summer. And so normal tour for them, we're on the field about like 12, 14 hours a day and doing about 40 competitions across the entire season while you're traveling across the entire country. So I was like, oh, if I want to survive this, I should probably start exercising. And so that's when I first really kind of started getting in the gym a bit. And then that first tour, I went from I'm a very tall 5'6", and I'm spoiled, it's not tall at all. But and also I was about like 5'6", 185, like none of it good. And then in the one season went down to like 5'6", 130 in like the one like 8-week tour. So that's literally like the amount of energy that these guys are putting out. Because even during that, like we were slamming our face with anything we could find, and you still lose that much weight. So then when I got back, I was like, oh, okay, lost a bunch of weight. Maybe I can start trying to take this like gym thing to another level. So that's when I really started kind of like kicking it up and started reading a lot more. And eventually became a personal trainer for a couple years in LA. And that's when I started trying to be the quote unquote evidence-based bro. So I could like help out all my clients and stuff. And but at the time I was still like trying to pursue the music thing. And then after I left marching, I met the trumpet professor at the University of New Mexico and was like, hey, we work pretty well together. So why don't I go to UNM to kind of finish my music degree there? And during my second year there of my trying to finish my bachelor's in music, I kind of got burnt out on it and was like, I don't really feel like spending all day in a practice room anymore. And so I was like looking around, I was like,
Did
well,
you got burnt out on music?
Yeah.
Did you like stop listening and just
No, I mean it's I mean
drive with the radio off?
For some it is actually kind of interesting. Like even after I left like the classical music scene, I legit like couldn't go back even to like concerts or anything like that.
Hey, listen.
Only up until recently.
I'm sorry, but how do you get into classical music, bro? You're like, what, like 16, 20? How you get into classical music?
You get lost in the sauce, man. It's
what like I was
Beethoven,
in. I mean,
Galileo.
I started playing in fifth grade, and then I was in orchestras and stuff all through middle school, high school, college, and because I was at a JUCO in Cali for 6 years pursuing music. Because yeah, and because that's yeah, that was one of the things where well, I like to tell my students, like it's all, if they think they're behind, it's all good, because it took me 10 and a half years to get my bachelor's. Because I started college in 2007. I didn't graduate with my bachelor's until December of 2017. And I was in college the entire time. It was just 6 years music at a JUCO and then 2 years music at a 4-year, and then switched over to exercise science. But it was just, I just knew I really wanted to continue, like I wanted to do music as a career, and out of all the different genres that I was in, the one that I kind of gelled with the most was classical orchestral music. And
like Hans Zimmer?
Yeah, Zimmer. I mean, actually kind of funny with Zimmer. I mean, my first ever high school marching band show was Gladiator, which was Hans Zimmer. But we had to wear fun togas on the field, you know.
You look like the Little Caesars guy.
Yeah, exactly. That's why before every single show we stepped on the field, we started shouting pizza, pizza. But yeah, so then end of my second year in New Mexico, I was like, well, I don't really want to do this music thing anymore. So what else can I do? And I was like, well, I've been a personal trainer for a couple years in Cali. At the time, I was working at a vitamin shop, still kind of like selling supplements, and so I kept a toe kind of in this field. And I was like, well, why don't I do this kind of like fitness thing? And so I decided to switch over to ES. And how then that's kind of how we got to know each other, because it was still funny that so the first ES class I ever took was in the bowels of Johnson Center, and it was Introduction to Motor Learning with Dr. Kelly Johnson. He was not a doctor at the time.
That's quite an introduction.
Yeah, and I still remember the first day. He starts off saying like, "Okay, guys, we're doing a study of branched chain amino acids. If anyone's interested in participating." So after class that day, I like ran up to him after class and was like, "Hey, I don't care what you're going to ask me to do. Like, I want to participate in it, and I want to be a participant in it." And so then
you had no idea what you're getting into.
No, but I didn't care. I was like, I just want to do it because at the time I had been reading research. I had been listening to like what I thought were research podcasts at the time and such. And I was like, well, I want to finally get like experience with this thing that's been sounding really interesting to me. And so then the next class he comes in and he's like, "Oh, the girl who's running it, like she wants to meet you." Because later I found out it's because we're stratifying for like body type and stuff like that. So he walks me down to the basement of Johnson Center, where Trish is standing there in the bro tank in the bro tank biochem days. Yep. Doing something with separating PBMCs. Or separating some PBMCs, and then introduced me to Dr. Van Dusseldorp, and I guess if we want to be like formal here, or Trish, and then that kind of kicked everything off from there. So then I was the second participant in her dissertation, and then at the end of that, she was like, "Hey, you seem to oddly be into this stuff. Like, do you want to help collect data?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then everything kind of exploded from there.
Hey, listen, man, you came in clutch because we let you. I say we let you, but you analyzed the Western blots.
Yeah, I remember that one day I sat in the conference room and analyzed Western blots for 10 hours. Just circled Western blots for 10 hours straight. And
we appreciated that.
And so that was the introduction, and that's where Kurt and I could know each other as well on those like fun research visits, I guess you could say, when we got like bodies just all over the lab from people puking from what we were putting them through, and then analyzing Westerns and all that kind of stuff. Then when I needed to graduate, when she graduated, she went over to Kennesaw and she called me up and was like, "Hey, I've got an assistantship here if you want it." And so then I went over there. So decided to go over there for my master's. And then when I needed to do a thesis, I was looking around and I was like, well, this intermittent fasting thing is really popular, but we don't have a lot of good data on it right now. And I had dabbled with it, like even with my time back in New Mexico and stuff like that, even before like I was in the lab or anything. And so I was like, so why don't I try to look into this a bit more? So then my thesis, I say to this day, is still really the only study looking at resistance trained individuals in a deficit to look at what it does. There's a couple other studies to that we can get into, but they're not really, the goal of them isn't really kind of doing the same thing. And then one of the other guys in the US that was kind of doing something similar, his name was Grant Tinsley. And so he was the external committee member on my thesis committee. And so he called me up after my proposal and was like, "Hey, we're starting a doc program here at Tech. So do you want to be my doc student?" And once again, can't turn down free school. So then I decided to go out to Texas Tech for the next 3 years. And towards the end of that, needed to do a dissertation. So it's kept along the same lines of intermittent fasting, so looked at the effect of breakfast consumption and whether or not that affects your ability to lift later in the day, and whether it matters whether you regularly fast or regularly you don't fast or regularly eat breakfast. And then after that, somehow tricked the people here at University of South Alabama that it'd be a good idea to hire me. So now I've been here, kind of heading up the basic and applied lab for dietary interventions in exercise and sport for 2 years now, and been kind of keeping along that line, mostly doing a lot of still like nutrition, some methodology stuff, some body composition stuff, and yeah, that's kind of the long roundabout thing of how it started all the way back in 2007 to here it is 17 years later.
All right. Well, Matt, we want to talk about intermittent fasting today. Like I said earlier, it's a topic that gets a lot of hype, a lot of misinformation about intermittent fasting and all of that. So let's just go there. Is intermittent fasting distinct from just eating regular, but in a caloric deficit?
So, well, first off, distinct in adaptations or just because yes, because one of the things I do see is kind of a common misconception is that people think sometimes just because you're doing intermittent fasting means that you're in a caloric deficit, you're caloric restricting or something like that. And just for people that aren't sure like what actually intermittent fasting actually is, because there's a lot of misconceptions in there, like you mentioned, is that all intermittent fasting,
and there's a lot of acronyms too.
There's a lot of different acronyms. And so intermittent fasting is not actually one thing. It's all the different acronyms. And so it's a very broad term that encompasses a lot of different protocols. And so all intermittent fasting really does is just say, we just want you to eat between this time and this time. Like that's it. And then the other times like fast. And so that could be anything from fasting for 24 hours at a single time, or for whole days, which sometimes we'll call that periodic fasting when people are doing multiple like 24-hour long fasts throughout a week. Or for a long time, up until I'd say about 2018-ish, when you looked at intermittent fasting research, the predominant one you found was this one called alternate day fasting, which, like I tell my students, like a scientist, we're usually not that very original. We kind of name stuff after what it is, what it does. And so alternate day fasting, it's literally what it sounds like. You're fasting on alternate days. So you alternate a day of pure fasting, and then an alternated day of normal eating. So say you don't eat it all on Monday, then you eat normally on Tuesday, then you don't eat on Wednesday, then you eat normally on Thursday, and so on and so forth. Now, the one that most people think of when you hear intermittent fasting goes by two different things. The reason I say two is because it depends on what year you're looking at the literature from. So up until about 2018, 2019, you heard of this TRF, or time restricted feeding. There was kind of a push around that 2018, 2019 to kind of, instead of calling it TRF, to call it TRE, for time restricted eating. Because the idea was, when we look at animal models, we're feeding the animals versus humans. Like, we're not feeding the humans. Like, the humans are out in the wild eating. And so we should call it time restricted eating. I honestly don't care. But I know some IF researchers that do. And I'm like, cool, you can waste the cortisol on that. I'm going to look at the research. But essentially what that is just, that's what most people are familiar with when you hear intermittent fasting, which is those daily fasts that typically limit eating to anywhere from 14 hours as sort of some of the longest protocols you'll see. So that'd be an example of like only eating between like 10 a.m. and 8 p.m. or 8 a.m. and like 6 p.m. and fitting all your food in that kind of window, and then fasting the rest of the day. All the way down to sometimes you even see as short as protocols. Now, to be fair, I haven't seen this in the literature, but I have seen it in the field of like people doing protocols where you're down to like only eating, limit eating to only like an hour a day. Also, sometimes you'll see what's called OMAD, or one meal a day, which kind of falls into that. but the most common protocols you'll see are 16 and 8, which means fasting 16 hours a day, eating 8 hours a day, or basically eating from like noon to 8 p.m. or 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. And then fasting the rest of the day, or the 20 and 4 protocol, which is putting all your food in a 4-hour window. So things like 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. And then fasting the rest of the day. Those are going to be the two most common ones you see. Now, there are like, even with TRE or TRF, there are variants within that. There were people like to argue about like delayed versus early TRF and all that kind of stuff. But that kind of gets kind of into the weeds a lot more, that I don't know how much people want to get that far into just categorizing stuff. But yeah, to almost skip your initial question of like, is it distinct? So far, pretty much most of the data set is not really, no. Most of the data, spoiler alert, kind of shows that all we're actually really doing with these protocols is just tricking people into eating less. So it's just a better way that we're just selling people to eat less. Now, it is interesting.
Wait. Do you mean to say, you meaning calories in versus calories out?
Unfortunately, I think the laws of thermodynamics still kind of.
Shit. God damn. We thought we found a biohack.
I was like, we haven't found a way to truly
optimize our way around the laws of thermodynamics and shit.
I mean, my career would be a lot more exciting if I could say that it was.
You'd have a Nobel Prize, bro.
Exactly. We could just solve all obesity. We'd no longer have any kind of metabolic diseases, and all I'd have to say is just skip breakfast. Like,
what's crazy? You know what's crazy? And well, not to like
you're
go
good.
off on a tangent, but you know what's crazy is I'm a little bit older than you. I'm older than you for sure. But when you probably remember, right? When we were coming up, it was like you have to eat every couple hours. It's small meals here and there, graze throughout the day. Breakfast is the most important thing. Like smaller meals throughout the day, frequent eating, meal frequency was like the best for body composition and like metabolism and health. And now it's like completely 180, where it's restricting meals and restricting calories and eating fewer meals throughout the day.
I think I grew up with that mindset too. Like I was always being told like, oh, you gotta have every single meal to be healthy. You gotta snack throughout the day.
Was that your grandma telling you that, or was that the gym bro?
Not the gym bro. I didn't actually start going to the gym until like later. But like health classes would tell me you gotta eat every couple of hours if you want. You gotta stay fed.
Stokes your metabolism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, it's that's one thing I like to talk to students about, is that everything just goes in cycles. Like it's the same. I mean, even with as long as I've been in this, and I've only been in this since like 2005, 2006 is really when I kind of started working out. And even within just that time span, I've seen intermittent fasting kind of come and go like 2 or 3 times. I've seen keto come and go like a couple times. And that's only within like a 20-year span. And so if you go back longer, you can find even longer cycles of it. So it's like there's nothing really new. And I think part of it always comes out of like, I think a big thing I've seen, gym life has always, a lot of people that I think gravitate towards gym life are kind of like to be the anti-culture. And so gym life almost kind of moves in that direction, where it's like, for the mainstream, for a long time, it was 3 meals per day. And so the gym life goes, okay, we're going to be anti-culture. And so this one person says 6 meals a day. Cool. Yeah, I'm doing what the peons don't know about. Like, it's 6 meals per day. That three meal a day is bullshit. And then all of a sudden that starts to become a little bit more mainstream, because people are saying that's what you got to do. And then it's like, oh, well, actually, now that everyone's doing that, the real thing to do is skip those meals. And I don't know like how much of that actually consciously comes into it, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some like subconscious aspect of that kind of going into like a lot of gym culture always has to kind of fly in the face of like mainstream culture of like they are the ones that really know best.
Right. That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
And so the same thing, you know, the intermittent fasting, I guarantee in a couple years that'll kind of be like on the way out, and we'll start seeing a lot more of the like, no, like we initially thought several years ago, actually, like it really is the 6 meals per day because like this one poorly conducted study came out said that it was, and that's gonna explode. And we can go into like the origins as well of like where I think a lot of the intermittent fasting and lifting kind of came from as well. But like, yeah, I think that's a lot of it as well. Unfortunately, is where there's the one study that comes out that everyone likes to gravitate towards. That when you look into it, there are issues, but that doesn't sell as well.
What in particular? What study are you talking about?
Well, I mean, so in I think with fasting, where I like to kind of I think, especially within the lifting culture, pull it back to the Morrow 2016 paper, which in and of itself, if you look at like Tatiana's a good researcher, and I don't think there's a lot of purposeful issues with the study. But for a long time, Morrow 2016 was the only real paper that it came out using resistance training in general. And so when you look at resistance training and intermittent fasting, you had Morrow 2016, and then the next paper didn't really come along until Tinsley 2019. There was the Tinsley 2017 paper, but that was a very different style paper. And then my thesis in 2020. And then even since then, there really hasn't been that much that's come out. And I think when you look at when you look at the goals of it, and especially with how intermittent fasting works, like if we look at how that 2016 paper was set up, it was looking at a group of lifters who were trying to maintain body weight. So the first thing there is, I don't know how many people go, I'm trying to maintain, so what I'm going to do is just stop eating. Like anytime I look at people using intermittent fast in the field, it's pretty much people trying to lose weight. So, and then they said the reported calorie intake for both groups on average was about 2,800 calories per day. And then they had them eat at 3 meals per day. With the normal group, it was at 8 a.m., 1 p.m., and 8 p.m. And in the fasting group, it was at 1 p.m., 4 p.m., and 8 p.m. And just personal experience doing these, especially since they were getting nutritional guidance from dietitians and that kind of stuff, I'd be very surprised if the group that said they were eating, the fasting group that said they were eating 2,800 calories over those 3 meals, were actually eating 2,800 calories. Now, I think it's very likely they reported eating 2,800 calories on their dietary records. But what we found, especially if you go back to like the Stoat 2007 paper, which is one of the first ones kind of looking at a 4-hour feeding window, and where what they did was over, I believe it was 8 weeks. I apologize if it wasn't. But they basically looked at 1 meal per day over 4 hours versus 3 meals per day kind of setup, and tried to, again, make it isocaloric so everyone ate the same amount. And the group in the 4-hour, eating the 1 meal over 4 hours, ate about 65 less calories per day, which doesn't seem like that crazy. But then when you extrapolate it out through the length of the entire study, that 65 calories less per day pretty much equates exactly to the differences in body comp changes they found at the end. And when they interviewed the participants, they said like, hey, if we had been allowed to eat less, we would have eaten less, because we were essentially having to like stuff our face to the point of almost vomiting to get to that 65 calories less.
Right.
So that Morrow 2016 paper, they were the first ones that they kind of came out with this, and the group that was intermittent fasting, so eating it at 1 p.m., 4 p.m., and 8 p.m., supposedly having the same isocaloric meals, they lost fat, while the group that was in the normal diet group didn't. And so a lot of people in the resistance training world looked at that and said, hey, this group that was intermittent fasting, eating the same amount of calories, started losing fat. So there's something must be magical here about IF. Like I can eat the same amount of calories, and as long as I put it in this 8-hour feeding window, like I'm golden. Like I'm going to lose weight and I'm going to be able to maintain muscle mass. I'm going to increase lifts like they did in the study. And I'm going to improve all these biomarkers, like insulin sensitivity and all that kind of stuff. But then think about the practicality of that. Like, again, thinking back, when there's studies in the literature, we see kind of have these like weird results, and we kind of go back to, okay, what's the actual potential mechanism here? If we think to the old Occam's razor or think horses, not zebras, the simplest answer is probably the correct one, that I would honestly largely guess that it was participant compliance issues with the way it was designed. And again, they did a similar study in, I believe it was 2020 or 2021 in cyclists, where they tried to do something similar, and showed again similar outcomes. But then again, in that one, they were saying these cyclists consumed about like 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day in 3 meals, which again, technically possible, but I would be very surprised if actually happened. And what probably happened is, they may have, even because they said they were doing it in a cycling camp and everything, and they may have, provided that much food to the participant, but I'd be surprised if the participant actually consumed all that food. And so then when we move forward to say like my paper and our paper in 2020, where we actually controlled for diet and put everybody in a 25% calorie deficit. So again, kind of mimicking what people are actually using it for, using a calorie deficit. So people are eating less. It's easier to eat less. So ours average calorie intake was around 1,900 calories per day. And ours, we didn't directly say like, you can only eat in these 3 increments. So we did the typical thing that's kind of like what a lot of people do, is it just said like, here's the calories per day I want you to hit. Here's the protein per day I want you to hit. You can make up the carbs and fats however you want, and you can eat throughout the day however you want. Eat throughout that 8 hours however you want. Then I find, especially if you allow people to graze, then, I find those kind of calorie intakes much more easy to believe than just this distinct meals. And then when we did that, we didn't find any differences in body composition whatsoever. So everybody lost the same amount of fat. Everybody maintained muscle mass the same. Everybody, got stronger for both leg press and bench press. And so, we answered the most important question, that you can actually increase your bench press on intermittent fasting. So it is possible to try to outbench your gym bro, even if you're intermittent fasting. But the main thing that matters there is just, okay, eat the same amount of calories, eat the same amount of protein, get the same results. And so far, I haven't seen any other study come out that has, when you dive into it, that hasn't been able to kind of disprove that. Because anytime I've seen differences in stuff, because there's been other like training studies that have come out since then, but pretty much every single time it's the intermittent fasting group. It's basically what they just tell them to eat ad libitum. So they say like, okay, go out and eat however you'd like. All we're going to say is just only eat between noon and 8 p.m. Outside of that, we're not going to tell you any type of dietary advice. And then either the caloric restriction group or the control group, whatever, they directly say like, we want you to eat X, Y, and Z. And in those instances, when they say like, oh, look, the intermittent fasting group lost more weight or something like that, and you go look at the calorie data, it's because the intermittent fasting group ate less calories. And so again, shocker, eat less calories, lose more weight. And
that answers a specific question, but like an actual meaningful, useful question, but it's a different question, right? Mm-hmm. If you're talking about body composition changes, improvement in body fat percentage or weight loss or body fat loss, and intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding or whatever leads to that, because the practice of it leads to less calories consumed throughout the day, like that shows from like a practical perspective, like that is a plausible strategy for that goal, right?
Exactly.
But that's very, very different. And this is what you were getting to, especially with your study, is that's very different than if you were to actually make these diets equal in terms of calories and also protein. That's super important, right? But is there, and again, going back to my question earlier on, is like, there's no distinct difference between how you time those meals and those nutrients and those calories. It comes down to the consumption of the right amount of calories and nutrients and proteins and things like that. So, you know, for the studies that allowed those people to consume ad libitum, like practically, that's great data, right? Hey, because I have, you know, clients that have used intermittent fasting before, and you know, like those studies would suggest, it just helps them eat less calories at the end of the day, and they're able to lose weight, improve their body composition, and that's great. But that's a different question than is time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting, if everything is matched and controlled for, any different or distinct than just consuming the same amount of nutrients, calories, and protein just throughout the day.
Yeah, and I actually think despite, you know, I always get crap for this, but I actually think it's a great thing that we didn't find a difference, because it just gives us more options to use with clients.
Right.
Because
yeah, exactly.
If we did really find that intermittent fasting was this magical and then everything, then it comes down to, okay, everyone has to intermittent fast, and you're going to work with people that don't like intermittent fasting, and you're going to work with some people that do like intermittent fasting. And so since this shows that there was no difference, then that says, okay, cool, for the people that don't like intermittent fasting, I can use a myriad of other techniques for them and get the same results. And the people that do like intermittent fasting, I can use that with them and get similar results. And so I'm not worried about having to worry about my client, my patient, whomever is missing out on something because they're not doing some protocol that they hate. This just shows us, like, yeah, if you got somebody who, you know, wants to maybe lose a little bit of weight, doesn't really like counting calories or tracking a bunch of stuff or something like that, using some of these protocols can help them, like, inadvertently cut some calories without thinking about it, to kind of move in that direction. And then, but if you got somebody that, you know, they try it for a while, they hate it, they just much rather, you know, track their food and all that kind of stuff throughout the day, and that works better for them, awesome. You do you, man, you do that. So it's the old thing, going back to actually one of the first presentations I saw you give, it's like, you can, but should you?
Yeah. And is it necessary?
Is it necessary? And I think the more times we can, despite how unsexy it is, because it's much sexier to come in and say, like, these things do all these magic things. But despite how unsexy it is, the more times we can say, like, you don't have to, like, the better for working with more people in long-term compliance, because then we're making it easier for people to be able to follow things. And that's why, even though, like, you know, I've done a lot of work with intermittent fasting, I still like investigating it. And I think there's still a ton of utility in using it. And one of the roads that I'd like to kind of go down now is, like, ways that we could potentially manipulate it to help increase adherence. Because how many times do you work with people, again, like, they just can't stick to one thing or another to get long-term weight outcomes. And so and unfortunately, you know, obesity is a big issue in this country, even though, hey, at least last I checked, so this could have changed. Excuse me, by the time this comes out, it could have changed. But last I checked, we're only the second fattest country in the world. So we, like, made progress there. Yeah. But, you know, that's it. So we need as many tools in the tool belt as possible.
Right.
And this just becomes another tool in the tool belt, as opposed to trying to turn everything into a nail because I have a hammer.
Right.
I think I'm one of those people too. It's like, I've tried both IF and calorie restriction, and just from personal experience, calorie restriction is just so tedious. I don't want to keep track of my calories throughout the day. I don't want to keep track of my macros throughout the day. But the thing that I've struggled with intermittent fasting, well, at least in my personal experience, is making sure I get all the protein I need throughout the day. Because let's say I'm fasting my feeding window is only maybe like 8 hours from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how I'm going to get all that protein in my system in that short amount of time. I would feel so bloated, or I would feel I like I'm stuffing my face, like I'm going to throw up throughout the whole entire day trying to get all that protein in. So I think that's one of the issues that get brought up with using that tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that is definitely one of the hard parts, especially since we know, how like protein needs go up when you start dieting because of anabolic resistance increases and all that, like not so good stuff. And when we look at when people start fasting, the first macronutrient they inadvertently cut out is protein. So like, because think about it, like when you've been fasting for a long time, are you really thinking like, hey, I can't wait to have this steak? Or you're like, I haven't eaten all day. Like those fries and that shake, those are going down, man. Or like, I now have all the calories. I can eat all the pasta, all the cake when I get home. Dude, that mac and cheese isn't gonna know what hit it. And so because of that, protein does become a big issue. And that's one of the reasons why when you start working with people, dude, you do kind of still have to emphasize like, hey, when you eat, when you're building the plate, start with the protein content and then kind of build around the protein content. Because if people still cut calories with this, but then they don't eat protein, they don't lift, then you're still going to be likely to see the negative side effects of, caloric restriction with low protein and no resistance training of muscle loss. And then if you have significant muscle loss, then unfortunately we see, less of the beneficial metabolic outcomes that you're looking for. So intermittent fasting isn't special in that, and it actually can sometimes make it harder. That's why when you're working with people, again, if they want to do it to control calories, that's great. But you have to remind them like, hey, you're likely going to inadvertently cut your protein as well. So still try to make sure that when you sit down, like have a good amount of protein. But you bring up a good point that, you have to then start thinking about potentially different protein sources or supplementing a little bit more with like protein shakes or eating more of the lighter protein sources because it's easier to get more of that down than like super heavy, super fatty protein sources. Also, one kind of thing I want to bring up about IF that I see gets mistaken a lot is a lot of people think just because they're fasting means they're going to lose weight. So, because I like to use the example of, let's say you're working with somebody that needs to eat, I don't know, 1,800 calories to lose weight. And if I go home and I'm like, cool, I'm even doing a 24, so I'm only eating 4 hours a day. But you'll see maybe where I get this example from here in a second. I just thought of, and so if I'm like, I need to eat 1,800, I need to eat 1,800 calories a day to lose weight, and so then but I'm only going to eat one meal per day. But I'm going to go to Little Caesars every day at 4:30 and get a full Little Caesars pizza, and then go home and wash it down with Ben and Jerry's, like a pint of Ben and Jerry's. Then cool, like I still may be fasting, but I still ate 3,000 calories in that sitting. And so I'm not going to lose weight no matter what you're fasting. But even though you may think like I'm fasting and people said if I'm fasting, it's going to cause me to cut calories. It only causes you to cut calories if you still eat how you normally would. And so if you still make the same normal food choices that you normally would, you can't necessarily switch the mentality of, oh, now since I'm not eating all this other food, I can now eat this other higher calorie food without any repercussions.
Right. It's still, like you mentioned earlier, Still comes down to energy balance. So you can be doing intermittent fasting, but if at the end of the day and then over the long term you're in a caloric excess, you're going to gain fat rather than lose fat, even though you were fasting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the benefits from, especially from a body composition standpoint, and I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the metabolic health markers as well from intermittent fasting come from the calorie restriction that's associated with the practice of the intermittent fasting.
Yeah, so that's what it's in pretty much most of the literature I've seen. That's what we would kind of attribute it to. There is a little bit of weirdness in some studies. Like I'll say, the one that everyone likes to cite back to is the Sutton 2020 paper, which was in pre-diabetics using a variant of time restricted.
I think it was 2018.
The Sutton paper?
2018? Yeah.
It is 2018. Man, I'm sorry. Yeah, Sutton 2018 paper.
I only know because you mentioned it to me the other day.
Yeah. But that was I believe it was a 5-hour window. So they had everyone eat, everyone was finished by eating by either 1 or 3 p.m. And there are other issues with that we can get into, but especially when looking at health markers and stuff, that's become a giant debate: is early time restricted feeding versus late time restricted feeding or delayed time restricted feeding. Which to give a quick overview, early is you still do the same like 8 hours feeding or like 16 and 8 or 20 and 4. It's just instead of doing the 16 and 8 being only eating from noon to 8 p.m., you eat from like 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Or if you're doing a 4-hour window, instead of doing 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., you would do 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., like that type of thing. So shifting it earlier in the day. To quote, the idea is based on some research using chrononutrition topics where it's potentially eating closer to the normal diurnal variation in metabolism, is the idea there. And so the Sutton 2018 paper was in pre-diabetics, and they did find a bit of a difference specifically in insulin sensitivity. Nothing really in like much else. And but one of the big things there also was there was no delayed time restricted feeding group. So they tried to make the argument that it was in part
because it was earlier.
It was earlier, but there was no delayed or like normal comparison. So we can't really say, was it intermittent fasting in general? Was it the fact that it was early? Or in a lot of research like that, where they try to do a dietary control. So what they'll do is a same crossover individuals, and I believe it was crossover. They have them go through a period of the early time restricted feeding, then a bit of a washout period, and then the control, the normal diet, whatever it might be. Is in some of those instances, they've already kind of like the metabolism is altered already by losing weight or whatever you're doing in the first arm of the crossover. So whatever you look at in the second arm isn't going to be as well controlled as you would normally expect in a true crossover study. So I'm still, since that's pretty much one of the few papers to kind of show that supposedly in a calorie control without people losing weight and stuff like that, I'm still hesitant to truly say that intermittent fasting, even if people don't lose weight, they're going to increase insulin sensitivity. If more stuff like that comes out to say that, yes, bald man, you're being dumb, just like your hair, like, it really does help, then I'll update my opinion. But currently right now, like I haven't seen enough data for me to say that the improvements in things like insulin sensitivity, glucose response to feeding, improvements in blood pressure, triglycerides, vascular responses like augmentation index and all that kind of stuff are really going to be due to anything more than just the caloric restriction caused by the fasting.
Right. And, I'm sure you're familiar with these papers, but looking at that very question of, intermittent fasting versus just regular calorie restriction, and pretty much the entire data set. I mean, there were some, I don't want to say anomalies, but you kind of get different results here and there, just like with anything. But the majority of the data, especially with the meta-analysis, showed that there was no difference in body composition measures, fat mass, lean body mass. I think one of them might have said that there might be some lean body mass differences where the calorie restriction maintained it better. But that there's no difference with many of the traditional sort of cardiometabolic health markers that people are concerned about. Glucose regulation, insulin sensitivity, markers of inflammation. I think things like TNF alpha, blood pressure, cholesterol, things like that.
Yeah, and the potential differences in body composition maintenance. There could likely have been the how people, when they start fasting, like to cut out protein, so lower protein intake. And we can't forget that most of this data is in the absence of people exercising.
Yeah, definitely.
And
definitely.
So when people start exercising in combination with this, the effect of exercising and weight loss is going to, even let's say that there is some kind of benefit that we haven't truly uncovered for fasting and insulin sensitivity and such, that the benefit of just the losing weight and exercising is going to cause such a exponentially greater impact that I'd be hesitant to focus on just the fasting aspect than the exercise and weight loss. Because think about it, especially with weight loss, do we usually ever really want people losing weight without exercise? I mean, sure, people do diet without exercise, but if we're ever writing prescriptions and stuff like that, we're always going to want people exercising, because it's going to help maintain lean body mass as they lose weight, and that's going to be the goal. Because what's the goal? What's the benefit, really, of going from a 38 pant size to a 32 pant size if you still are the same, flab? If you don't look any better when you take your shirt off at the beach while eating In-N-Out.
Right. Yeah. If someone loses, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 pounds or more, but if the body fat percentage is still the same, that's not ideal.
No.
I mean, it's better.
It's definitely better.
Yeah. Right. But that's not something as us as practitioners and people in the field of exercise and health and fitness, things like that, we would never recommend, to your point.
And the more important thing is we got to make sure you lift so that you maintain biceps.
Yes, that too. Yeah.
I need biceps.
Yeah.
Most important muscle, I think.
With very little biopsy data.
But when I say biceps, I'm talking about biceps femoris.
You gotta
get some hamstrings. I love doing that one in my class, because when we talk, I always use the joke is okay, so let's say we're doing the most important exercise of bicep curls, and then I start doing leg curls, and people keep looking at me going what the hell are you doing, bald man?
They should have taken structural kinesiology with me or Kelly.
Yeah. I remember sat there front row with you, learned all about those ATPase enzymes.
Yeah.
For your presentation for Gibson.
Oh gosh, yeah.
I think I even remember emailing you for some of the papers you used in that a little while ago.
That's right.
So that tells you it was influential, man.
Well, I say I've come a long way since then. Okay, so from what I'm familiar with, from what I'm aware of, is because I know there was a thought and I had this thought too, that doing intermittent fasting would not be ideal for doing resistance training, in particular for hypertrophy.
Mhm.
The reason being that if you're eating less frequently and you're going a period of time where you're not eating at all, well, then that means you're not getting protein ingestion and you're not increasing mTOR and you're not increasing muscle protein synthesis, and therefore having less anabolism throughout the day, that which long term could lead to, less hypertrophy than you otherwise would have if you would have just eaten, protein meals throughout the day. Now, with your study, you didn't see a difference. Now, that was in a caloric deficit state, but also with other data, if calories in protein is sufficient and also matched, there doesn't seem to be a difference between in hypertrophy from resistance training with intermittent fasting versus eating throughout the day, including multiple protein meals within that day. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we haven't. The only one that actually really showed significant hypertrophy was the Tinsley 2019 paper in females. That one didn't fully match calories. So the way they worked kind of in that one is they tried to kind of they said their goal was to have body recomposition. So essentially keep weight about the same, but try to lose fat, but gain muscle at the same time. And they did gain muscle. They said they tried to put them in about a 250 calorie deficit, but the way they kind of worked was they said, okay, we're going to tell you to eat this many calories per day, but as long as you don't go over that, then we're good. So we don't care if you eat significantly less than that, like just don't go over that. So in that study, both the normal diet group and the intermittent fasting group gained muscle. I believe it was about 1 to 2 kgs over 8 weeks. And then it was about 1 kg over 8 weeks. And then but only the intermittent fasting group lost fat. But then again, if you go look at the calorie data, the intermittent fasting group was the group that lost the most fat, was eating the least amount of calories. But protein intake was about the same, all that kind of stuff. So yes, I would say that currently, again, the main things that are going to matter are eat the same amount of calories, eat the same amount of protein, and you shouldn't really notice a difference. One thing that I do kind of think about, especially when utilizing intermittent fasting with the goal of hypertrophy, is we know like hypertrophy in a deficit is never going to be ideal. Like putting yourself in a deficit with the goal of hypertrophy. And I don't see a ton of benefit of using intermittent fasting without the goal being going into a calorie deficit. The only time that I can kind of think about it, so like we've all worked with people that, you're trying to increase their calories, but you don't want them to do a dreamer bulk. So where a dreamer bulk, where you eat everything in sight. And so like that's the one that every lifter goes on at one point in their life where they're still seeing like, oh, all these pro bodybuilders, they're eating 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 calories a day. So put on as much mass as possible. I'm just going to eat everything over the next year. And then you end up putting on some muscle, but you get pretty fluffy at the same time. So you have some dirty bulk. Yeah. I think like dreamer bulk, the true dreamer bulk is the like dirty bulk taken to the next level. And
why is it called dreamer bulk?
I don't know. Honestly, that's just the term that I always heard for it. Like again, unfortunately I can't give you the etiology, but the way I could potentially think about it is it's the bulk where you get to eat everything you dream about. So there's no food that's off limit. You dream about that food, you always think like,
what if you can't afford it?
Then you got to use less scrupulous means. So Maybe find some shards of glass in the food when you go out. Get your meal comped. Maybe some dines and dashes. Maybe bring a big tote
once in a
bag.
while when it's 2 a.m., you gotta do a dine and dash.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
When you're rolling 20 deep, the bill ain't gonna be pretty. So you're like, hey, let's go.
And or you go into that self checkout, and then you just happen to forget to like scan a few things. Everyone's got their ways.
We're not
Or
endorsing any of these things.
no, not at all. Or
We're
what
aware
was
that these things do happen, though.
Yes, exactly. That's the thing. We can't ignore them because they happen.
We can't ignore them.
But we have to talk about it because it's things that happen out in the field, but we're not endorsing that people
I think the
follow
real
these
dreamer
methods.
bulk is when the food, you don't have to pay for the food.
Yes.
That's the real dream.
That's one of the biggest differences from when I started my fitness career to now, is that back when you could still get your parents to buy all your food that you wanted to eat, to then moving out and having to buy all the food and all the subs yourself, then you start to realize, okay, maybe I'm just gonna cut for a while. Because
well, if you work at NutriShop, you could just find some shit that fell out the back of the truck. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Or, stuff people happen to return. I'm just
put that box on the shelf.
yeah, or
they ain't worth the restocking fee.
Exactly. That shipment that came in, it just happened to be a couple tubs short. Or we're just sampling, we're putting some stuff out for, customers to sample. I bought stuff here, so I just happen to be a customer and I'm sampling it for lunch. But so, I mean, you make things work. I like that. But again, for intermittent fasting, I could see that sometimes if you want to put people in a surplus, but you're having trouble keeping them in, say, like a slight surplus, then something like intermittent fasting that makes it easier to eat less because you're compressing the food, so you're going to feel fuller for a little bit longer, like while you're eating. That then I could potentially see an argument for using intermittent fasting while someone's in a surplus and a goal of like hypertrophy. But kind of outside of that, I'm really hesitant to say, like, anytime someone's real goal is hypertrophy, to intermittent fast. And it's more so not because of like decreasing meal frequency issues. It's the issues of making it harder to eat the amount of calories that people need to eat to gain the muscle that they want.
Right. So to reiterate what you just said, everything in the last, like 10 minutes, I can do intermittent fasting and still get huge and jacked and swole and get compliments from ladies all over the gym instead of just buff dudes.
The one thing I'll say with that is, how many dudes have gotten into lifting with the goal of getting compliments from girls around the gym, and then who do they actually get the compliments from?
Other buff dudes.
The other buff dudes.
Right.
It's that chain.
It's the chain that has to be.
So I was saying, I'm not saying intermittent fasting is going to get you compliments from ladies because you got
But also in the end, it's totally possible, but
it's technically possible. Might want to, if that's your goal, might want to work on your personality a bit. Not you personally, just whoever is using that as their goal. I think that's going to help them get compliments more. But
don't you got a girlfriend?
I do. I mean, I'm just saying for practicality, like for other people listening to this.
It's for a friend.
It's for a friend. It's totally possible to get swole.
Hey, I guess the thing is just like, is you get compliments when you're out in the field, but as long as you come home to roost, like, maybe she doesn't care.
And I'm just fishing for compliments at this point. It doesn't matter from who. But
Well, I like your mini Kurt beard. So there's your compliment.
thank you. I can have sleep for dinner tonight.
Or I still, since you mentioned that anatomical kinese, I still love that the structural kinese was still the origin of the beard.
Yeah.
That class was the origin of the beard.
That was when I started, when I stopped shaving. Yeah.
Because you'd come, I forget his name, but you'd come in. There was the one dude in the class that had a giant beard, and every day you'd come in and ask him about his beard, and then like halfway through the semester, you were like, you know what, I'm gonna grow a beard, and then that was 9 years ago, something like that.
Yep.
I always wondered why you had a beard like that. It's because of another guy, huh?
Well, that, and then also my barber in Albuquerque would always tell me every week, "Hey man, you gotta grow a beard. You gotta grow a beard. You can grow a beard." And so finally, after like a year, I was like, "All right, I'll try it." Never went back.
At least,
Crisp Barber Lounge in Albuquerque with that boy Mikey.
you.
I owe him my life.
You at least had enough hair to go to a barber.
That's where my student loans went. That's where my stipend went.
All the fitness tests.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I will say, like, some of the more mechanistic stuff that we can talk about for why you shouldn't necessarily be as worried. One, if anyone's interested, I'll just do a little shameless self plug here, just because it's the paper I'm most proud of, but one of my least cited papers that makes me sad. Is I did publish a paper kind of on the mechanisms where the same thing, kind of going over some like protein metabolism stuff, one of the passions of both Kurt and I of autophagy, and kind of debunking a lot of that, especially with my background in intermittent fasting. And that's a very common topic in intermittent fasting that doesn't like annoy me at all, that people keep claiming that autophagy does all these magic things for it. But I do have a paper on that was published in 2022 in Journal Nutrition Reviews that I highly recommend, because I think it's pretty good, because I wrote it, and unfortunately, because it's not as sexy, it doesn't, and it's more mechanistic, it doesn't get downloaded or cited as much. And instead of sleep for dinner, I'm having tears to drink myself to sleep. But exactly. But so far, when we look at protein metabolism stuff, we don't really actually see that big of an increase in muscle protein breakdown until roughly about 72 hours of fasting, actually. And there's a couple papers looking at intermittent fasting specifically. For instance, there was the PAR 2022 paper. Now, again, there's issues with every paper. Not saying any paper is perfect for extrapolating, but essentially they found that doing an 8-hour feeding window for 10 days when people were eating an isoprotein diet, didn't decrease muscle protein synthesis before or after the 10 days. So that's some of the mechanisms of why we can kind of say, like, I wouldn't, as long as you're eating the same amount of protein, I wouldn't worry too much about you're going to be at a greater risk for losing muscle while you're fasting. And if you are trying to use it while still trying to bulk, after all the things that we talked and kind of joked about with it, then likely you still will be able to build the same amount of muscle. Now, I will say, like, we don't have any data using intermittent fasting in a surplus. So if we do get future studies and we do have direct data in intermittent fasting and people using a surplus with the goal of hypertrophy and all that kind of stuff, and that proves me wrong, then I'll update my opinion. But based off the mechanistic data right now and the data we have kind of in maintenance or slight deficit and deficit, I would say eat the same amount of calories, eat the same amount of protein, you should see same results.
Right. Yeah.
So while we're on the topic, personally, I want to ask for my own personal gain. I'm very selfish, so I want to ask you. I like to, if you've ever heard of power building,
Yes.
I power lift. I like to power lift, and I also like to aim for hypertrophy. So
Mhm.
in the realm of lifting for strength and power, type training combined with IF, what would you have to say about any benefits or any downfalls in that type of training?
So one thing when talking about using training and them consistently, one thing I got to put as a big caveat is all the data we have right now is with exercise being within the feeding window. So people are not performing this exercise fasted. We can get into a little bit of like the acute data on potentially if that might affect it or anything like that, if you want to exercise fasted or not. But as long as I like to think as long as you're keeping what I've noticed to help prevent decreases in performance the most in the gym with stuff like that is I try to keep any kind of peri-workout meals and stuff kind of relatively similar. And I found as long
Peri
as
meaning during,
like pre and post.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
like PRI, like perimeter.
yes.
Like, okay,
Yeah.
like surrounding.
Yeah, Perry versus.
Did you take the GRE
I think
recently?
it's like periosteum.
I don't even know Spanish. I don't know Latin.
Yeah, Perry versus intra. So intra would be during, Perry would be like pre and post. And but just been working with people, what I've just noticed, the way to kind of maintain performance the best on it. Because for something like power building, a lot of times you're looking at performance. And well, yes, we have data looking at like changes in strength, changes in power over long term, changes in hypertrophy. The acute differences in performance hasn't been as well looked at. But again, if you keep those similar, then you should be kind of I'd say you'd likely be good. I notice it's easier to maintain as long as people's pre-workout meals kind of stay roughly the same in that kind of acute, maybe like 1 to 2 hours before the workout, like you don't change nutrition that much, then performance still kind of maintains the same. Because especially like my dissertation, we looked at the impact of breakfast consumption on afternoon performance. And so what we did with that is we brought a bunch of people in and we either fed them breakfast and lunch or had.
What'd you feed them for breakfast?
So it was really interesting because it was trying to find a way of, because they breakfast and lunch were all the same food just at lunch, so that they went into the workout eating the same amount of food before the exercise session. So we couldn't necessarily say that if there was any differences, it might have just been because they ate less.
Right.
And so breakfast was the brown sugar cinnamon oatmeal from Quaker. Then the blueberry RX bar. And I feel like there were some of the things I was reading. Then I know in there as well we had Uncrustables, as well as a chicken burrito bowl, like a Marie Callender's frozen chicken burrito bowl, which is actually pretty good if you haven't had it. And then some of the like 100 calorie granola bars. And the reason we did all that is because we also fed them relative to their body weight to try to get them to about 40%. So if we had like the lighter females that we had, they didn't eat that much versus like some of the people that we had that were 240 pounds, like they were having to slam down like 3 packets of oatmeal and like 2 bars. And then, yeah, it got pretty interesting. But the hard part with that was because you were looking for food that was like when you split it up, it's still like somewhat satiating, but then when you put it together, it's not such a big meal that it's like vomit inducing.
So you weren't cooking them up eggs and papas.
Unfortunately, no, no, um, no breakfast burritos.
I don't know if they have tapatio, if they sell tapatio in Texas. Oh no, for sure they probably do.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It was in Lubbock. I mean, granted, Lubbock is Tex-Mex, but
Yeah.
but yeah, you still get Tapatio, but no Blake's breakfast burritos. Um, and um, but yeah, so gave them that, and then had them come in uh after about 2 hours after they had lunch, and then put them through a squat bench dead workout, which was 4 sets of squat, 4 sets of bench, 4 sets of dead at 80%. First 3 sets were to a 9 RPE, last set was to failure. And then looked at a bunch of things like how many repetitions they got, barbell velocity, power, all that kind of stuff throughout the workout. And also, we looked at did it matter if they habitually had breakfast or if they didn't normally consume breakfast, to try to look at some psychological components there, because there's some data suggesting that especially when you look at resistance training, there's a large psychological component to people exercising fasted or not fasted, or potentially not having the same kind of meal pattern before they worked out. And we found on average, in terms of those things, it didn't make a difference. Now, one thing I did think that was interesting was we looked at preference data. So the majority of people, even the people that, because we asked them like which protocol did they prefer doing and which one did they feel like they had a better workout during. And majority of people still prefer the breakfast and lunch condition, like splitting it up like that. Even when they thought they had a better workout in the lunch only condition. So they were like, yeah, I know I performed worse, or like I feel like I performed worse, but I actually still preferred splitting the meals up like this. Really, the only time that we saw people prefer the lunch only condition was when the meal was larger, and they said that they preferred it because it was closer to what they would normally eat. Like the size of the meal was closer to their normal like size of their pre-workout meal. So again, kind of going back to the psychological aspect of like us being like habitual animals in nature. But as long as even with that, it was like, as long as you're eating the same amount, like you should be fine. I know a lot of it kind of keeps coming back to that. I'm not trying to sound like a broken record, but unfortunately, that's just what a lot of the data is pointing towards. Now, again, I was just going to say, until we have more like longitudinal stuff kind of, then we can only take so much from an acute study. So we can look at all this stuff and say like it didn't matter in this one instance, but when you compound that over and over and over again, is it going to matter? Then maybe, I don't know, but so far I haven't seen enough to make me worry about it.
Right. And then also like I read your paper recently, and I tell my students this, but whenever you look at a research paper and you look at the results, you're looking at means, right?
Yeah.
Of course, standard deviations as well, and now it's more common as well to include the individual data, individual responses, right? But you're looking at means on average of not, the mean doesn't represent any single person, nor does it represent like all of the people, right? Everyone responded differently, and this is just the average of that. And so looking at a paper, looking at a results, looking at the mean, you should never take that as like an expected result if you were to do this thing that they did in the study, right? And that's particularly true with like perceptual, subjective measures, right? And one thing I thought about when reading your paper is, on average, you saw that there really wasn't too much of a perceptual difference, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But someone should not take that as like, okay, if I were to eat breakfast or skip breakfast or whatever, that this is what I should expect to feel, right? To expect to perceive and feel the same things of the subjects in this particular study, because maybe for you, you're not going to respond or perceive or feel the same way as any of these subjects, especially when they're all combined into one single data point as an average, right? And so not to dissuade or discourage someone from trying something. It's like, oh, well, there wasn't a difference in this paper, so I'm not going to try it, or I'm going to expect a particular result. Like, no, it might work for you, right? Don't just look at a paper and a mean and expect like, this is exactly what is going to happen in me if I were to try it.
Yeah. And so this, what the mean kind of tells us is like, on average, this is what we would kind of guess to happen, but you might not be the average person. And so what I say is, when we're looking at research, that's helping us kind of set up things where to start and our guess of what's going to happen. But when you're working with people, everyone's going to respond differently. So you're never going to say like, oh, this person is responding this way, but I'm not, even though that's going against what this paper is saying, like, I'm not going to like change what they're doing or like treat them in a different personalized manner just because like the paper said I should do this, so this is what I'm going to do. It's like, no, the paper tells us and helps us kind of figure out where to start and where we expect things to go. But then based on how the person actually responds to it, that's what you work off of, not what the paper says to do and how they respond to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because like I said, we had people that I mean, just like any study, you're going to have hyper responders and non-responders. I mean, we had individuals, on average, we didn't see a difference, but yeah, we had individuals in one condition. They were able to, especially for deadlift, which was the last four sets of the workout, where they, on their normal day, they were able to get like 5 or 6 reps. And then on one of the other days, like they literally couldn't get the bar to move for a single rep. They couldn't get the bar off the ground. And so whether or not that was physiological or just psychological, that actually happened, that for that individual, that was a real data point. That was a real like thing that happened. And so if I'm working with that person, I'm like, okay, maybe we don't do that again for this person.
Yeah.
But on average, that's not what we see. And so when I'm starting to set stuff up, I can go like, okay, on average, we can kind of expect this, so I'm not gonna worry about it. And then, oh shit, that didn't work for this person. Okay, let's not do that. Despite the paper saying like I shouldn't have to worry about it, for this person, I will worry about it.
Right. Yeah.
Just to add to that, that's a crazy protocol. Now that I'm thinking about it, 4 sets of SBD at RPE 9 in and of itself, even if you're fasted or not, that's still pretty tough, like physically and psychologically.
Yeah, no, it was rough. But don't like I put myself through it before I made all my participants go through it.
We love pilot, right?
Oh yeah, we love
piloting.
Hey, I will say like it's nothing compared to like 8 sets of 10 with a 4-second eccentric with 80% of your 1RM.
Yeah, that was
and then Kurt having to pick me up halfway through the sets while Kelly was sleeping in the office next door.
You needed your white blood cells for Brotag Biochem.
Yes. I still say to this day, I've been through hundreds of studies at this point, probably hundreds of protocols, and that to this day is still the worst protocol I've ever been through.
Yeah, it's rough.
But we all went through it.
It is a known protocol to induce muscle damage.
Oh, and it did.
Yes. We published a paper here using it as well. Do you have any other questions?
That's all I got there.
I think I had one more. Oh, yeah. Let's finish up with autophagy because podcasts, social media, TikTok now, online loves autophagy,
especially with fasting.
Yeah. I did a video. It'll be up by the time this is up on autophagy, and it included some on intermittent fasting, but you wrote about that in your in that 2022 paper,
Yes.
right? So can you speak to the current data of autophagy intermittent fasting in humans?
Yes. And I just said the real question there is going to be what data. And the reason I kind of say it that way is, unfortunately, we have very few studies that have actually really tried to assess autophagy and intermittent fasting in humans. Most of where the intermittent fasting and autophagy literature comes from is mice models. And one of the big issues we have there is similar length fasts in mice models are not going to equate to similar length fasts in humans. Because mice have much faster metabolisms, glycogen, especially liver glycogen, gets depleted significantly faster, which is one of the things that's really kind of needed to kind of help kick off some of the stuff of fasting and such. And so that's why it gets really difficult when we get a bunch of people and where a lot of papers, and I even review a lot of papers that will try to make this claim in published literature that, oh, these benefits are likely in benefits in insulin sensitivity and all these types of things are due to increases in autophagy. But again, they're basing it all off of mice models. And so we need to look at human data. And so there's been only about 2 papers really that I'm aware of that's kind of tried to look at this. And so far, none of them have really been able to kind of conclusively show that there really is kind of any uptick in autophagy in the length of time that most people would normally fast. So if we think about like a normal 16-hour fast for a mice, now again, unfortunately, we don't have a direct like conversion for me to say like, oh, if a mouse is fasting 16 hours, that equates to a 32-hour fast in a human. But if we're to say like within the normal range of a fast, like 18, maybe 20 hours, that might equate to a mouse only doing, I don't know, let's say like 4-6 hours or something. And so for their data where they're showing an uptick in like a 16-hour mouse model, a human may have to fast for 36, 48, 72 hours to even have a shot at seeing some of the same things. Whether they will or not, again, I can't directly say because we don't have, autophagy data in that. The closest thing is we have a little bit in, I believe it was a 16-hour window in the Jamshed paper. And even with that, there's the big issue when we look at autophagy of, are we looking at blood markers or are we looking at using muscle? And I know in that paper, there is issues with that as well as what's really going on when you have an uptick in some markers of it, but not in others. And so you're not really getting a clear window about, are we actually seeing anything? So far in a normal 16 to 18-hour window, I wouldn't expect to actually really see any increase in autophagy, especially to any kind of significant degree. If somebody's doing a regular 24-hour fast or a 48-hour fast, maybe, but again, I think that's where you're going to have like the best shot at it, maybe, if you want to go out that far. But again, like how practical is that? How often are you going to be doing that? And that length is going to increase if you're looking at body composition changes. And what I mean by that is like the heavier the person is, the longer they're going to have to fast before seeing any of those benefits. Because at least from what I've seen, to have a lot of things like autophagy really upregulate, you need certain things to happen that are going to take a lot longer to happen in more overweight individuals. For instance, like helping deplete liver glycogen, true falls in insulin to a low enough level, all that kind of stuff it takes significantly longer for that to happen in heavier individuals. So if he gets a heavier individual that's trying to increase their autophagy by fasting so that they can become more insulin sensitives to help them lose weight and all that kind of stuff, like, well, if a lean individual could do it in 24 hours, for example, the heavier individual may have to do 48, 72 hours, or I don't know. And then there's some really weird data out there about training status and how that might impact it. Because in one paper, granted, this wasn't directly with fasting, this was just looking at like autophagy and exercise, and looked at an exercise bout. I believe it was an exercise bout while fasted on its impact on autophagy, and it was cardio based. And they looked at people that had a VO2 over 55 and lower VO2, and actually only showed that it increased in people that had a lower VO2, and the really well-trained people didn't actually have an increase in autophagy. So there's going to be a lot of stuff there that I'm like, so again, with that point, you're going to get a lot more benefit from just watching what you eat and do all those things than worrying about the magic of autophagy to come in and save all your woes. Autophagy is great and cool, and I love it, but it's unfortunately not the magical panacea cure-all, and that if you just skip breakfast, you're going to get all these magical insulin and muscle sensitivity effects because of an increase in like ULK1.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned that Jamshed paper, and then there was another one that the name is escaping me. But similarly, I think it was some sort of time restricted eating protocol. And similar to the Jamshed paper, they saw some markers of autophagy increase, but like you mentioned, it was blood markers, right? It was in whole blood. So it wasn't cell specific. Now, presumably it's coming from, white blood cells, right? But then also the other thing, which is fine, right? We measured it in white blood cells, but we actually extracted the white blood cells. Did that for 3 years. But that's very, very different than like the people online talking about, increasing autophagy and, in the brain or in the liver or in the muscle or in fat tissue or whatever, presumably, they're talking about some specific tissue. Actually, I take that back. I don't think they even thought that far, right? Autophagy, good. Turn on autophagy, right? Because then in what tissue? What tissue are you talking about? And, there's no answer for that from most people. Like, they haven't thought further than that, then autophagy, good. Turn on autophagy, right? Which, it's fine. You measure in whole blood. Presumably it's coming from white blood cells. Like, that's fine. But then also the other thing it was from mRNA, right? Which that is completely different than measuring the actual proteins involved with autophagy. And someone might say, well, there's mRNA, so later there's going to be proteins, but, not necessarily, because there's regulation that occurs at the mRNA level. So just because you have increased amount of mRNA doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have translation of that into protein. And this is not to really throw shade or downplay this data from these two studies, but, Dr. Zuhl, Micah Zuhl, he told me once. He either told me once or he told I forget. But if you have mRNA, great. But really, though, if you don't have protein, who cares? Yeah. Because the mRNA don't do anything. They just encode for the protein, because the protein is the actual thing that causes function. Yeah. So, from these papers to say, oh, these, intermittent or time restricted feeding increases autophagy because these two papers showed, it's like, you really can't say that, because you just measured the mRNA abundance, which again is not protein, which is not function. So you're not actually showing changes in autophagy. You know what I mean? And then, there are some other data that look at longer periods, like 36 and 72 hours. And in those data, there are some increases in some autophagy markers, LC32 and P62 and things like that, in skeletal muscle. And I believe these were in younger males. And in one study, it was untrained individuals, but not trained individuals. And again, to your point, like you mentioned earlier, there are going to be specific differences between different populations, including things like train state. And, the idea of, and it's also tissue specific, right? When autophagy turns on in skeletal muscle is going to be different when autophagy turns on in liver or in the pancreas or whatever the case is, or adipose tissue. But I lost my train of thought. I'm getting hungry.
You're not fasting?
I'm fasting. Yeah. No, what was it? Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, but based on, I'm going to clip that out. But based on the data that are out there, which again, like you mentioned, is like very, very few, there's no way that you can come up with some universal autophagy prescription, right? Fast this number of hours, only eat this number of hours, fast 72, 36, 1 meal a day, TRF, TRE, whatever, right? There is not enough data to base any sort of practical prescription based on the current body of evidence. Yet, obviously, as you know, a bunch of people on podcasts and YouTube and social media go out and say, give these autophagy prescriptions, but there ain't enough data for that.
Yeah. And sometimes one thing are there times you even want autophagy to happen?
Right.
Because especially for autophagy to increase, like what do we have to have decrease? Like mTOR, protein synthesis, and all that. And we want that happening as well. So there's always, an interplay of things. You want autophagy to happen, but sometimes you want autophagy not to happen. And any type of pathway, if you upregulate it too much, bad stuff happens. Like again, and like mTOR, I know it's complex 1 versus complex 2 and stuff like that, but if you look in some tissues, increased muscle growth, you're jacked, cool. In some tissues, increased mTOR, cancer growth, bad. It's not so like site specific. Do you always want it? Luckily, the body is pretty good at trying to like balance and maintain things the way that it's kind of meant to. And so really trying to go against that in some instances, like you're going against evolutionary biology there, where we evolved to do something for a very specific reason. That do you really want to disrupt that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess the one last point on the autophagy stuff is from a practical perspective, right? In humans, we don't know what the actual effect of changes in autophagy activity actually even mean.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you're saying, not, autophagy up is always good, not necessarily. But then, also how much autophagy is needed. Mm-hmm. How much of an increase in autophagy actually leads to improved function? 1%, 10%, 20%. We don't know because we can't do things in humans like we can do in animals or even, cell culture research, but you can't, we don't know what the actual direct impact of differing levels of autophagy from intermittent fasting or even exercise, what the actual practical impact and outcome are of those things. And, targeting a mechanism like autophagy or some other specific mechanism from a practical standpoint is, besides the point, right? Mm-hmm. Because as you know, as we talked about in class, an outcome is not a function of one specific mechanism, but it's a function of dozens and dozens of mechanisms that lead to that specific outcome. And so trying to target through your training and diet a specific outcome is completely missing the point. And you should, with your training and diet, targeting the actual outcome that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Like I like to think back to, I think a great example of that is when we looked at like the insulin hypothesis for a long time, where a lot of people for weight loss thought, insulin just mechanistically, stimulates glucose to get deposited in adipose tissue and decreases, release and decreases lipolysis and all that kind of stuff. So based on that one mechanism, insulin is evil, and we need to keep insulin as low as possible to lose weight. Well, there's this beautiful thing called metabolic redundancy, where essentially, like, if throughout the body, if one mechanism kind of goes down, we have other mechanisms to kind of create the same thing to happen. And so then when we look at studies that went, okay, let's look at how much does insulin levels throughout the diet actually play a role in whether or not people lose fat, and through things like sugar intake and stuff like that, found people can have high insulin levels and still lose weight just fine, and the same amount of weight as if you kept insulin levels super low throughout the entire diet. So it's really not that insulin high mechanism equals bad. So the same thing with like autophagy, trying to target everything around autophagy, like, how do we know that's the thing that you want to target? And then doing all the things, because even if autophagy is low, you can have backup mechanisms to try to achieve some of the same things that a high autophagy would. So, like, what's the point?
You guys are blowing my mind right now. You're trying to tell me that I should not be training for autophagy? All this training I'm doing in the gym for autophagy is not working?
What's your favorite autophagy exercise?
Bicep curls.
Correct answer. Not calf raises?
No, just bicep curls. Just the left one.
I like to do like finger curls, but just the left one.
I like lysosome squats.
Yes. This the sissy variation.
I heard those are good for insulin sensitivity.
Don't make you sensitive.
Yeah, there's I guess last point on this. There's something that I say in class to students is something could be physiologically true, like something true at the level of the cell, but at the level of the whole body in terms of impact in a way that we would actually care about, like not true at the level of the human body. Physiologically true at the level of cell, but not true at the level of the whole organism, the whole human.
You do have that in class.
Yeah.
That one example I think of is kind of like that whole argument with what's that one artificial sugar? I forgot what it's called.
Aspartame?
Aspartame, yeah. A lot of people say like, oh yeah, aspartame is really bad for you because it causes cancer in cells, but in reality it's just in cells, and we don't really see that in the scope of just like the whole big picture with humans.
Exactly. All right, Matt, we got one last thing, okay? All right, we're gonna do a meme review.
Yes. All right.
We're gonna look at some intermittent fasting memes, and you're gonna let us know how you feel about them.
Perfect.
This is a cool guy.
But what you don't see is the watch on his wrist, because he's waiting for his fasting window to end. He's one of the same memes as earlier, where he's just sitting there waiting, like, when this time comes, I got 5 minutes left, but I'm gonna be ready to hit some chicken.
Look at his eyes.
He knows what's about to happen.
Just waiting. He's just waiting.
So he's actually the next contestant on Hot Ones.
Hot Ones, there he is. Yep, the cool, whatever type of bird that is. Yeah.
Okay.
A distinction without a difference.
Actually almost used this line earlier because there's a comment that's how intermittent fasting became to be, man. It was just, we had to have a name for something, and had to like turn away into just being lazy and skipping breakfast into trying to make it seem like, nah, I'm actually like intermittent fasting. I'm doing this really fancy thing like you haven't heard of yet. Because especially being from Cali, like, I don't know, we sometimes like to do stuff that people aren't hip to yet. And so like if it's like that, it's that band that you just, we know them because we saw them play the Underground Club the other night, but sorry, like you're just not cool enough. You probably haven't heard of them yet. And that's where intermittent fasting came from with this.
Yeah, everything's got to be a thing. Everything's got to have like a name or an acronym or some cool thing. Like meal prepping is just like, I don't know, packing your lunch, or like I don't like vegetables, so it's carnivore. You know what I mean?
I'm gonna come up with a diet that and name it for just basically anything I hate. Still the weirdest one to me, my favorite one, I still haven't figured out how this actually works, but it's Aeritarian.
Aeritarian?
It's a version kind of under intermittent fasting, but they literally believe that you can get all the sustenance you need. You don't need to eat. You just need to walk on the grass and in the sunshine and get all the nutrients you need from the sun and absorbing them from the grass through your feet.
They doing photosynthesis?
That's apparently I've learned how to do some photosynthesis and create essential amino acids from sunshine.
What's their mortality rate?
That's why I really want to try to look into this a lot more, because there's stuff that doesn't make sense here. Like I'm convinced they've got to be that one person, they're doing like OMAD or something and saying they're not actually eating. And it's like, oh, this food doesn't count. It's like Diet Coke doesn't count.
Yeah, you got called bullshit on.
Yeah. So, yeah, everyone, I mean, we just want to skip breakfast. And that's actually how I explain to intermittent fasting to some people when they're like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. And I'm like, how often do you wake up late and right before class, right before work, and you got to run out of the house, and you get busy at class, busy at work, doing whatever, and then next thing you know, it's like 11 o'clock and you haven't eaten. I'm like, congratulations, you just did intermittent fasting.
You just didn't hashtag it.
Exactly.
I had a student one time I was teaching for a lab. I mentioned that I was hungry and that I'm not gonna eat until like after class, and they were like, "Are you intermittent fasting? You're trying to lose weight?" I was like, "No, dude, I'm just broke." I'm not doing anything fancy. I just can't afford breakfast.
That's
later on.
I was like, intermittent. That's the only thing we'll add on top of it. Millennials turn skipping into breakfast and being broke and intermittent fasting.
Yeah, it helps. Later on, I told them I'm actually on the seafood diet. You know about that one?
You seafood, you eat it.
Yeah. You beat me to it.
It's the great diet, man. Especially if you want a dreamer bulk.
I think that's a great way to end it. Matt, Dr. Stratton, thank you for your time.
Yeah, no problem.
It's been a good one. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks for educating me. I learned a lot today.
Well,
it's been real. It's been good. It's been real good.
I was just saying, hopefully you can use some of the things that you got educated on to get those gym girl compliments that you were pining for. 'Cause that's what we're all here for.
I'm asking for a friend.
They're a friend. They're a friend. That's right. I won't tell your girlfriend at all.
All right. Do you want to give any, I don't know, like your Instagram or your Twitter or MySpace information?
So I'm not on any social media except MySpace. Actually,
I
Friendster.
better be on your top 8.
I was gonna say, actually moving to Friendster pretty soon.
Zanga?
Yes. I'm still using Ask Jeeves personally for everything. But yeah, so if you want to get a hold of me, the only social media that I kind of am on is Twitter, or X, I guess as you want to call it now. But I will pretty much, if you go check my like X timeline, it's just me retweeting papers that sounded kind of interesting, so that when I find time to read them, I can go back to my timeline and pull them and actually read them. It's not me saying that they're actually like amazing papers or anything. It's just ones that sounded interesting and I want to read later. So things like Instagram or Facebook or something like that, technically I have accounts, but if you send me a friend request or a follow request on Instagram and I don't accept, don't take it personally. I just only check that like once a year. So it's not that I'm ignoring you, but if you want to get a hold of me, you can either Twitter, which is MTS Strength 89, or actually the best way by far is just email me, which I am an assistant professor at the University of South Alabama here in Mobile. So email there is just my name, Matthew Stratton at southalabama.edu. If you're interested in any intermittent fasting supplement stuff, we are currently looking for grad students, and so I do have some PhD openings in my lab. If any doc students out there are interested in any of this stuff or the science behind getting jacked or better ways of telling people how fat they are, aka body composition methodology, then hit me up. Otherwise, I need some good hair tips on how to shine my head.
All right, man. Well, appreciate it. Appreciate you doing this, especially for the first one, man. So,
really, hopefully, it's going to be a really low bar, the hurdle for everybody else, but that's mostly because I'm 5'6".
Hey, you know what? Whenever we get that AG1 sponsorship, then we'll know that we made it. We arrived.
I better get recognition.
Which I will turn down.
Yes. Okay, but Casper metrics. Squarespace?
What?
Squarespace? Yeah, if you're not getting the AG1, we can get the Squarespace. You can get sponsorship or HelloFresh. You could have like a cooking episode where we talk about how to best use the HelloFresh meals to get them gains.
Better health.
Exactly. See?
Well,
helping you out, man.
We'll know when we start getting the calls.
All right.
Yeah. All right, man. Hey, thanks. I appreciate it a lot.
No problem.
All right, peace out.
Peace.